So, being treasurer, my name is Srini Simhan. I'm the Central Regional Director. I'm currently covering for the Grand Treasurer, Alex. He's out on work. And so, yeah, this is being treasurer. So, you have two definitions. One is per the Policy Procedure Manual, and one is per the Constitution. So, the PPM, Section 2.1.5, the treasurer keeps chapter funds and financial records, develops and maintains a chapter budget, orders all insignia through the central office, which has changed a little bit more recently per Jim's earlier announcement. Makes semi-annual dues payments to the central office no later than March 15th, November 1st of each year. Sends all that information to the central office for the new initiate, and that will happen through the CMT's pledge form. Together with the initiation fee, the price of badge, and collecting the initiation fee as well from each initiate before initiation. The one thing that I want to note there are two things I want to note is the badge stuff. Like Jim mentioned, this is probably going to be voted on to change at convention. But the badge stuff is going to be directly with whoever the vendor is instead of through central office. And then in regards to the initiation before making sure that people pay the initiation fee and stuff before initiation, you want to make sure that's done, because the last thing you want to do is initiate someone and they don't pay. And then the chapter has to pay for them, and then they either may never pay or they just disappear all of a sudden, and then you never know how to track them down. So make sure that you are, getting that initiation fee and all that, their GPA, all that other stuff that has to be done before they're allowed to be initiated. Make sure that is all set in stone before you initiate them. Per Constitution, 7.5, chapter organization, the treasurer shall keep the chapter funds and financial records and collect fees and dues. They need to make a monthly report to the chapter, make disbursements, and then make disbursements from the chapter treasury, which is the chapter's bank account. So the understanding of this is, as you look at the process and the evolution of recording reports, of record reporting, is say you have a box of receipts. Typically you take those and then you move that over to your paper records. And your paper records are typically like a paper ledger for account for the main account, and then also for each individual member of the chapter, so that you can keep track on paper, like have a paper trail, like the actual definition of a paper trail, to be able to look back on all these things to hold those things accountable. From there, you can move that over to additional record setup, which typically it's like Google Sheets or OneDrive or something. And then from there, you can use a commercial tool to do invoicing and stuff like that as well. So that might be the Peely app that was brother made. You can also use like Greek Chapter or Greek Capital Management, or another tool like Zoho or something along those lines. Why does it matter? You want the ability to audit so that you can trace back all of your purchases, all of your deposits, withdrawals, any payments that are made, and any receipts. Because having that accountability helps to make sure that you are keeping your records in line. The redundancy is only there. Like, I know it seems redundant and it seems unnecessary, but it's there because you want to build that security. You want to make sure that you have backups to backups, and that they all match up consistently. Because if not, then obviously there's a discrepancy in terms of where spending was handled. And if the notes that you're taking shows that you're supposed to have a different amount than what's in the bank account, then something's probably wrong with that, right? So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of all those things. It also allows for you to be able to take all your previous history with the chapter and be able to forecast how you can handle your budgets moving forward for better committee programming, or for hosting a regional conference or things like that. So the three main things when it comes down to handling a chapter's records are having a cash book, having a checkbook register, and having a member's accounting page. And that's coming into like a little bit more of the virtual side. So although it's three separate entities, they're all interrelated. Books have a secure system of verification that's apparent and auditable if you ever need to do a financial audit. And the main reason for having something like this is a member's payment record can be cross-referenced through whatever is written on the cash book to whatever's on the member's accounting page. It also helps you keep accountable for the funds that are deposited and withdrawn, to make sure that is matching up with the bank accounts as well. The checkbook register is balanced and reconciled each month when the bank statement arrives. So you can, every month when you get the bank statement, you can use that to ensure that everything looks like it's in order. And then the payee of the check, you can usually verify that with, your actual like checks or check images, and like make sure that the check went to the right place, whether you are giving a reimbursement to somebody or somebody's paying to the chapter via check. So you always, essentially with this, you want a place to be able to track all your dues and how you're managing your chapter's finances. but also be a way for you to self-track and make sure that you are holding every member of the chapter, including yourself, accountable with the understanding that this is how the audits are being handled. So by this method, one could annually, or more frequently even, like go through all the sum of all the monies received by the chapter through the cash book or the accounting pages or the bank, or look through the bank statements and make sure that all of those things match up. And if they don't match up, it probably means that you should probably call for an audit, and sit with a few members and go through every single financial transaction over the last year or however you need to make sure that you understand where the discrepancy lies. Because the last thing you want to do is find out that somebody stole $300 from the chapter and it just, nobody kept track of that. Nobody kept record of that. And so you have this issue here. So that kind of brings into budgeting 101. So there's incomes and expenses. So things that come as an income to the chapter are things like national dues, your health and safety dues, your initiation fee that each member pays, the chapter dues that they pay on a monthly or semesterly basis, sometimes annually, donations and sponsorships from companies or alumni, and then student government, depending on the university. Some student governments will allocate funding to chapters. So that can sometimes be an income. And then expenses are at a national level. There's the national dues and health and safety fee. And then there's committee activities. And that's typically where you spend all your money in the chapter. My recommendation when it comes to budgeting is that as a treasurer, you're in a position where you got a little bit more weight on your shoulders. And so you want to make sure that the chapter is sustainable after you leave, not just for when you're treasurer, but giving it to the next treasurer that it's as sustainable as possible. So the recommendation is that you budget for a savings. So whether it's 10% or 50% or 20% or whatever, you take that and you put that into a savings account so that in case of emergency or something happening, your chapter knows that there's a little bit to work with in the case of a health and safety issue, or you need to do a last minute, payment, or somebody needs to be able to pay to go to national convention. Otherwise your chapter will get fined, things like that. You want to make sure that you have a separate savings set aside, which could be for chapter activities and could be for the future for the chapter, for the generations after you. It could also just turn into you being able to plan a few larger events for your chapter, but more so for the first one. So this is how you kind of break down a budget here in terms of how each of the expenses, incomes are being handled for the chapter. Why does this matter? Is that this should be reported to the chapter monthly so that the chapter keeps track of those budgets to make sure that they're not going past these budgets for each of the committees. You want to make sure that you're not spending more than you're bringing in, because if you do that, then you're going into the red and it's not good for the chapter. And going into the red meaning you're wasting money that you did not originally approve and allocate for in your budget. And it also facilitates that there's a pretty clear understanding of each of the activities that you're doing. From a peer-to-peer electronic transfer perspective, so this is a little bit of a different topic. So you got apps like Venmo, Cash App, Google Pay, Apple Pay, PayPal. And the thing to note with all these is that there's steps that you need to take in place as a treasurer to make sure that you're protecting the chapter. So never do a peer-to-peer transaction between a treasurer's account and somebody's personal account, because in a lot of cases, a lot of these apps are not federally insured. So it's a really easy gateway for accessibility to something that could make it even easier for somebody to try to embezzle money. An example of this is once upon a time, a active wanted to pay dues and they decided to pay to an organization and they thought it was their chapter, and it turned out to be a completely separate organization that is not related to Theta Tau. You might not want that to happen. So if you want to protect your money and protect your actives, money getting to the right place, make sure they're paying dues, not over Venmo or Cash App or something. Make sure they're paying it in cash or in check or something that you can physically trace that is insurable. And I say insurable in the sense of typically with the digital apps and stuff like that, Venmo is not FDIC insured, right? Which means that you can't get it. It's not backed by any financial institution, which means if you ever were to call an audit or tried to call for a reimbursement or something like that, they're just going to ignore it. They don't have any federal inclination to actually help you out with that. So ways to safeguard it when you do have these apps for your chapters, make your complex passwords, make sure you're setting up your two-factor authentication, make sure you're transitioning that between your treasurer/regent per semester. If the chapter has a bank account, making sure that bank account is set up properly and that is transferred when your officer transition happens, that gets immediately transferred to the new officers in your chapter. You also want to make sure that balances are transferred to a reputable financial institution. So whether it be like Bank of America or like America or whatever, Huntington or whatever. You shouldn't do it really more than once a week. After chapter, you collect dues, you go the next day, you drop everything off, you're good to go. So just keep that in mind. So a couple funny memes. I didn't actually make this presentation, but these were a couple of memes that were added that kind of relate to the treasurer's role. So yeah, if you can pay your dues today, that would be great. And also dues aren't really even close to being high enough. For sometimes that more so relates to when a chapter committee wants to expand their budget from like $50 to $700. Yeah, that's a conversation to have with the chapter when you're doing the budget at a chapter lock-in or a chapter kickoff, to make sure that they are being held accountable, to be like, hey, this is your budget that you're allocated for. If you go past that, then you're not going to get the reimbursement unless the chapter votes on it to approve it. So make sure that you are keeping track of how the budget's being handled and that you are saving money and staying within the confines of that budget, because otherwise you could lose a lot of money there. So 3, what does 3 represent? 3 represents the number of embezzlement cases over the last 3 years. And it sucks to say this, but it does happen. And usually being the treasurer means you're one of the more trusted people in the chapter. And it really sucks to be in this position, but this is why it's important to have a paper trail and to make sure that there's accountability, so that in the long run, you can always look back and be like, yep, everything is clean. The books are clean. I am good to go in terms of handing off my position to somebody else that I can trust to continue the chapter's legacy. And so you want to make sure that all of your ducks are in a row, because otherwise it turns into a very messy situation very fast. So show me the money. Lessons learned. So some of the things that we've learned over the years is that you want to make sure that you're checking the university's policy for handling cash. If your chapter has any tax status that's a nonprofit tax status or a university education nonprofit tax status, making sure that you're filing those taxes. Talk to your alumni association if you have one of those. Fines should be defined in all your bylaws documents. So if somebody misses, initiation or a pinning ceremony or kickoff or something like that, if that's a $15 fine versus like if that's a $70 fine, like that needs to be defined somewhere. Because as long as you can point back to your constitution, chapter bylaws and say, this is where we voted on this, that this would be the agreement for you missing something here, it helps to reduce that like unfamiliarity that e-board will just end up making a decision and being like, it's $70 for one person, but 120 for somebody else. Like that's no bueno. So make sure that everything that you do in terms of fines is actually outlined in your governance documents. So your bylaws. Be mindful to bank access. You want to make sure that it's only should be your region and your treasurer, your active current region and treasurer. And that is because you don't want like 16 people with access to your bank account. On that note, debit cards. The last thing you want to do is have a debit card for your bank, because what ends up happening is somebody could just start using it or steal it from you. And then now they can use the chapter's money to do stuff. And you may never figure that out until you go and like get the bank statement and you're like, what are all these things? So my recommendation, stick to the checkbook. It usually works out better in the long run too. And yeah, so try to make sure that you're limiting the access and debit cards as well. From there, making sure that you're overseeing your chapter's invoices. CMT does populate a little invoice tab. It's a new feature. So if you have any questions on checking that out, you can actually look on CMT. It'll tell you what your invoice is, exactly what it's for, the due date, the amount, and you should be able to use that to pay off any invoices to the National Fraternity there too. So cool. So some cool updates. The chapter grant program allows for chapters to get up to $2,000 worth of funding for chapter activities. Typically, I've seen it go towards things that are like service oriented or PD oriented. But the chapters may receive one grant per a single granted period. So I believe that means like within a biennium timeframe. It might be within a year timeframe. It might need to check. But these funds are meant to be able to support your financial programming, so that that are educational or philanthropic in nature, and that way you don't have to pull that out of your chapter's budget. So if you want to make blankets, if you want to make mittens for like people in need and the homeless people, mats, rugs, things like that, you can actually request that funding through here and turn that into maybe a chapter brotherhood event, putting rugs and mats, things like that together. I think the Maryland chapter actually did something like that pretty recently, where they made a bunch of like blankets, if I remember correctly. And it's been a pretty successful event. They originally had allocated a couple years ago for like $500, I think, and I think this year they maxed out with 2,000, and they used all of it and had a really successful event. I might be mistaken on the amounts there, but I definitely remember it was Maryland there. The health and safety fee restructure, they're moving it from being an annual thing to being twice a year, and it can be quarterly if you're on a quarterly system. But this helps to ensure that you're not overpaying or underpaying for people in your chapter that are active or on co-op or whatnot. This will be issued at the same time as regular dues, and this is going to be based off of CMT. So it's really important that you make sure that CMT is always up to date. Work with your scribe and your region on that. And if you have any questions in terms of like the invoicing and stuff like that, like CMT's financial page has been developing. If you have things that you want to see on CMT, make sure to let us know, because otherwise it's not going to be made. It's Frank Ventura, brother Frank Ventura, is the one that handles CMT, and he's been building everything in house. So that entire application has been being built for the last few years. So improvements and things like that won't be made unless somebody like recommends, hey, I need this feature added, or hey, this is the bug that's coming up. So just keep those things in mind. If you ever are not sure about anything, like feel free to engage with anybody on Discord. You can also email Alex, the Grand Treasurer, at treasurer@thetatau.org. Now, coming to this, in terms of backup plan, I'm going to come back a little bit towards those three things we were talking about earlier. So in terms of a cash book, when you write a cash book, you want to make sure you're recording the date, the amount, the sum of the money, if it's a deposit or withdrawal or like a reimbursement, like the purpose essentially for it. If it's a check, cash, money order, credit card, debit card payment, whatever not, you want to make sure that that is inked out and like physically written out so that you can keep a running record of everything that's happening regarding each and every single one of your members and for the chapter's overall bank balances. When funds are taken to the bank, like you want to make sure that that is done to the date of when those payments are made. And after each of the deposits, that running balance that you have of like money on hand should be zero. You shouldn't really be carrying any money on hand. Sometimes it might seem like it's a good idea, but in the case that something gets stolen or your car gets broken into or something like that, the last thing you want to do is to have all that money disappear. So make sure that monies received from fundraisers or alumni contributions and stuff are also recorded in there so that you can ensure that the actual bank account matches up exactly with what your chapter's bookkeeping says. From there, there's a checkbook register. So deposits recorded in the checkbook register must match the date and the amount as shown in the checkbook. And so this really comes to you being able to take this, and whenever you're making a check payment, that it matches up directly with your cash book. You want to make sure that like if you are writing the check and it's like check 0001, that number is written in there and that it's accurate and that like all of that information matches up, because you'll always have the receipts of your like receipts. They're kind of like loose when you're writing a check. But you always want to make sure that you have that written record there, because if not, then when you try to match these two things up, it can get really messy really quickly. So make sure that, the whole point, kind of what I mentioned earlier, is that you want a paper trail and you want accountability for every single action that happens financially with the chapter. And that's not just to cover the chapter's butt, that's also to cover your butt. Chapters, you're encouraged to use dual signature checks, and that just means that the two people that are the signees that are attached to the account should both sign off on it to ensure that everybody is on the same page, so that it doesn't turn into like a treasurer making like a $700 reimbursement check without telling the region or something like that. Not saying that has happened, but like I said earlier with the number 3, that's happened in the past. So we want to avoid that happening or even having the potential to happen in the future. Then there's the member's accounting page. When an entry for funds is received and is made in the cash book, each member's accounting page should be brought up to date to reflect each of the payments on his or her account or their account. And so you want to make sure that these member accounting pages, this is where like using electronic payment stuff would come in handy. But on a strictly physical level, you would want to have a page for each and every single member to account when you charge them for dues, when they've paid for dues, when they've, paid money that they earned through running a fundraiser for the chapter and things like that. You want to make sure to outline all those things, because from the time that they become a member and that first, initiation fee, pledging fee comes in, to the time that they graduate and they're, trying to close their account with the chapter, essentially, like you pay all your dues and you close your account, you want that number to be zero. You want the chapter to not have to owe them money, but you also want to make sure that they don't owe money to the chapter as well. So it's very, very important that you handle this on a member-to-member basis to make sure that you can close off a member, and that way it helps you to also keep track of alumni that may have tried to graduate without paying any dues. You probably should reach out to them and get them to pay their dues, and show that if you have all of these things to hold them accountable for, that they can, then be held accountable for. And if they don't want to pay their dues, you have a paper trail, and that's where the conversation about collections comes up, where it's like, do you want to use collection services to get them to pay their dues? Because if they don't pay their dues, that means somebody else in the chapter has to be paying their dues regularly enough, and the chapter has to budget to save enough to cover everyone's costs. Because what happens is every member pays to the chapter pays to nationals. Members don't pay directly to nationals. So if nationals charges an invoice to the chapter for all these people that are initiated, and only half of them get actually make their payment, that means half of them are skating by on somebody else's dues. So you want to make sure that dues that we are paying for each chapter are going towards what we think we're having them go towards. Granted, this is all part of the same understanding that this is what it's going towards to pay off these invoices and things like that. But if one person or two people decide, I'm just not going to pay dues for my entire time in the chapter, that's not brotherly, that's not fair. You want to make sure that they're getting their dues in on time. But yeah, on that note, that should cover everything I had any notes about there. Does anyone have any questions? I personally don't have recommendations, but what I would recommend is find something around your campus that is accessible. You might want to talk to some of the other Greek organizations as well around campus and see what they might be using. But typically you'd want to stick with one that that your campus would always be able to access. So if you're at UCM, right, in California, or said, yeah. So if they have a specific, University of California bank system, you might want to set it up under that. If you want to set it up under a Bank of America or something like that, something that's a little bit more generic that has been around for a long time and it doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere, you can also go with that route as well. And if you have any questions on that, you can reach out to me or the Grand Treasurer or your RDs as well, and they should be able to help you get that set up. Yeah. So I'm looking at the chat. So yeah, Peely app, if you actually message me on Discord, I can send you a flyer and a contact information to talk to Skylar. He's one of the brothers that helped create the app, and they actually have a discount for chapters that want to set it up. So what you could do is maybe get it set up with them and do a beta testing to see how it works with your chapter, how it gets set up there. But they are very, very approachable. They're very brotherly, and they'll be able to answer any questions you have on the Peely app as well. Sweet. So on that note, it is almost 8:50 Eastern. Complain since we switched to Peely for dues, members get charged 3 to 4 for processing. Are we really insisting on using Venmo because of fees? Okay, I got your message. So Bryn, for the 3 to 4 processing fee, that the other option is that you can have them just pay by check or pay by cash to the treasurer, and the treasurer should be able to deposit that into the bank and keep track of that. That should help to remedy that. But in reality, the usage of Venmo probably isn't the best for the chapter's health. If you want to make sure that from looking at it from a member perspective, there's a convenience factor. But like I mentioned earlier, with the convenience, there's the added risk factor, and you want to make sure that you're minimizing risk for the chapter there. So if the chapter is really insistent on using Venmo, they can always bring it up with the Grand Treasurer But it's also been a central office stance to not use it, and also an EC stance to not use it because it's not federally insured. I'm going to start pulling up that. Cool. All right, Isaiah, I will send you that as soon as I find it. But in the meantime, if anyone has any other questions, I am more than happy to answer them, at least to the best of my ability. Okay, I sent it to you, Isaiah. It is so this is the one that was given to us at convention, and it should still be applicable right now. But if you want to reach out to them, you should still be able to, get their information. Let me find Skylar's information actually and send that to you as well. All right, there you go. Yeah. On that note, do you have any other questions? I think Bryn left the chat, so it's just us. Okay, sounds good. In that case, I'm going to close the session then. But yeah, it was good. Hope you got some information off of that. If you need any help with anything, just again feel free to shoot me a message. But hopefully, I'll see you at Leadership Academy. See ya.